Hello everyone, my name is Davis, also known as Davis Trades on Twitter and YouTube. You may be familiar with my name as I've done educational content for Cheddarflow previously, and you can find that video on the home page of Cheddarflow. If you go to the left hand side of your screen and click on Education Center, you will see a video titled Talking Strategies with Davis Trades. In that video I went over a lot of information on using options order flow tab and the historical flow tab with regards to a trade I made in ticker symbol LMT. Today I'm going to do an educational video on the unusual volume tab. We're going to be discussing three main things. One, how I arrange my columns and why. Number two is the advanced way of using unusual volume tab and functionality in Cheddarflow, with three current examples from this data set. And then number three is combining the features of Cheddarflow with the unusual volume tab, so using the unusual volume tab with the options order flow more specifically, and then using that information and looking at a standard options chain on your brokerage platform, and how you can make good, conclusive, informative inferences that you can overlay on top of any current trading strategy. So before I get into this, it's all about proper sorting, comparison, and making good inferences when using the unusual volume tab. And when you combine that with your underlying system of technical analysis, it can be very powerful. All right. So the first thing you'll notice, as opposed to the options order flow tab, which you will see circulated data from this circulated most on social media, the unusual volume tab is slightly different. So for instance, the data that comes through here is already filtered by Cheddarflow, and you can use filters to get it down even more granular. So for instance, if we only wanted to look at opening orders that are above the ask, call only, and sweeps, we filter that data down significantly, and it gives us a very tight data set that we can draw pretty concrete conclusions based on the directional bet and directionality of this flow. But when you flip over to the unusual volume tab, you'll notice that there is no filter option, and we have a bunch more data here, and it's just a large data set. So how do we make good inferences on this data set that we're provided? All right, so that brings us to number one, how I arrange my columns and why. The first thing I want to do is I want to put the open interest over by option volume. And then the next thing I want to do is put the bull and bear percentage close together. And then I want to put the, let's see here, puts on the ask and calls on the ask side by side. So what that allows me to do is, just when I'm looking at this data, I can just see very easily the juxtaposition of bull and bear percentage, the juxtaposition of puts on the bid versus puts on the ask, and the juxtaposition of calls on the bid versus calls on the ask. And one elementary concept which I want to remind you of, that puts that are sold are bullish bets, calls that are sold are bearish bets, puts that are bought are bearish bets, and calls that are bought are bullish bets. All right, so that brings me to that takes care of number one, which is how I arrange my columns. And then on that second point is why. It's because it's easy for me to see, and it will become very clear and apparent why I have option volume and open interest side by side when I move into tip number two. And the other ones are similar. It's just easy for me to see, and I don't have to look past a number to get the conclusions that I'm trying to make. I don't want to make an erroneous conclusion because I'm looking at neutral and it's in between bull and bear, and it's easy to make those mistakes whenever you're just scrolling rapidly through. So I like to have it laid out like this. Number two, the advanced way of using the unusual volume tab with three current examples. All right. The three examples we're going to be going over are VXRT, ARCC, and OTOY. Now, I've already went through this data set and filtered it to for the time's sake of this video. But usually when I'm looking at this, I'll just filter it sort it basically just like I showed, and then I'll just scroll through it. So the first thing and the most important thing about this video is going over this one concept of looking at option volume as opposed to open interest. So and like I said, we don't have the filter button, but we have this sort functionality. So I can sort and I can see what stocks here or what tickers had the most option volume done. And one reminder that I want to refresh you on is that open interest is the amount of contracts that were purchased prior to the current day. I'm doing this on Friday, Saturday, so this data set is for Friday. So open interest of 3 million, those are the contracts that were transacted prior to Friday's trading session. The option volume is the contracts that were traded in Friday's session. What I'm looking for, and when I sort based on option volume, is I'm looking for option volume that exceeds open interest, okay? And the first one we see here is MO, all right? Now, this isn't a substantial amount of excess over open interest, so I would look at it, but I've already dissected this again for the sake of time in this video, and this isn't going to meet an example criteria. But what is going to meet an example for the criteria is VXRT. What we'll notice is that there's 256,000 or 257,000 option contracts traded on Friday over 156,000 in open interest. So what I want to do is I want to look just right here and just get a cursory glance, and I see that there was 36% bull, 34% bear, and then 29% neutral. So there's nothing to really write home about. It's not like 75% bull or anything like that, but it's enough to get my attention for me to look at the chart. And then I go over and I see where the calls were transacted. I can see that almost 50% of the calls were transacted on the ask, and then I can see that about 40% of the contracts were transacted on the bid, right? So yeah, there was a little more bullish puts on the ask versus there were the bid, but this is enough to catch my attention. 43% on the ask, 40% on the bid. And remember, put sold on the bid is a bullish bet. Calls bought on the ask is a bullish bet, and that's what I'm looking for here. Now, I don't want to allow you to make, again, some erroneous inferences here. Just by looking at these numbers, I'm not saying that this is 100% call activity and this or bullish activity and this is 100% bear bull activity. These are just cursory inferences. What I'm going to do in step 3 is combine it all to show you how you can kind of make even more informed decisions. But what we want to do here is just go through how I look at the data set, and then I'll jot these names down and then move forward into the next step. So VXRT is going to make the list. And the next one we have is ARCC. So we scroll down a little bit and you can see ARCC here. It almost has 2 times the amount of open option volume over open interest, right? But the first thing that we can see here is a huge discrepancy. There's 1% bull, 0% bear, and 99% neutral, right? So again, I like the fact that there's this much option volume over open interest. Ideally, I wouldn't like this to sit the way it does, but this is enough for me to continue again into step 3, which we will go over here in a second. So this section over to the right-hand side, right, this over here is more just support of this initial glance at option volume over open interest. This is what I'm really focused on here, because that shows me that there's an uptick in interest on Friday in the options market for ARCC and then VXRT, which I just went over a second ago. And that is very important to me, because when I see an uptick of interest in the option market, regardless whether it's bull or bear, it's showing me that there's participation. And where there's participation and options volume is increasing, right? The spreads are going to tighten, so that's going to decrease a little bit of the or increase a little bit of the margin of safety for some names that might have a wider spread. In addition to that, it could indicate, being the key word, that there is a move on the horizon. All right. ARCC is the second one, and then OTLY. OTLY is down here with 32,000 and 26,000 open interest, 32,000 option volume. I'll look over and look at this. 57% bull, 29% bear. This is really what I like to see here. I move over and I can see that 56% of the calls are done on the ask and 65% are done on the bid and the put side. This is what I really like. So even though this is further down in the sort, this is my favorite one. Why? Because of this data right here that we're getting. 65% of the puts were done on the bid, and then 56 were done on the ask with a 57% bull reading. Okay? So now we have our three tickers, and we have the way that I'm using this unusual volume. This is one way that I'm using it. For the sake of time, I really want to just focus on this one particular example of how I use this particular function in Cheddarflow. So with that in mind, now what I want to do is I want to take those three names and I want to go to the options order flow tab. And so now I can really start to hone in on what's going on. VXRT, look at this. We see that there is activity coming through on the options order flow tab, and I can filter this down even more, okay? So I can go to opening orders, or I can put opening orders, which is one of my favorite filters, and I see that there's a lot of puts coming through on the opening order side, but there's not a lot of premium coming through, right? There's not a lot of premium coming through. There's not sweeps. So, it doesn't really catch my attention too much. But again, with it being on the unusual volume tab, I want to take it a step further and I want to go to the chart. I'm using Thinkorswim. You can use whatever charting platform you want as long as there is an options chain. So we see this nice up move on an uptick in volume. Now I want to go look at the options chain of this, and I want to pull up the next week's strike and the monthly strike, okay? Because that's where a lot of the activity is going to be taking place. And here's the columns that I use to sort in Cheddarflow. There's your volume, and then there's the open interest. On the call side, here's your volume, and here's your open interest on the put side. So what I want to look at to see where that activity took place, see where a lot of that activity took place. I can see there's 13,000 and 15,000. Those two strikes draw my attention immediately. That's the $9 strike, and that's the $10 strike. So now I want to go down here to the monthlies, and I want to see what was going on right here. $10, they were being bought, right? But what do we see different on the monthly than what we do on the weekly? The monthly volume on this strike does not exceed open interest. Over here, they substantially exceed open interest, okay? So if I'm looking at this, and what I mentioned earlier is you can overlay this on top of your already existing strategy. So we've identified this name through Cheddarflow. We've dissected the flow on the options flow tab after we looked at it on the unusual volume tab. And now we've come over to the options chain to really see where that interest is inside of this name and on what strike. So there's a lot of interest for next week, okay? Now let's look over here at the put side. See, there's not as much interest on the put side, right? You see that? Now again, we don't really know by looking at this, like whether, what the intent is, because for every buyer and every seller there has to be, or for every buyer there has to be a seller, for every seller there has to be a buyer. We just know there's a lot of open interest here and a lot of interest in these particular strikes for next week that came through on Friday. So I want to go to my chart and I want to mark out 10 and I want to mark out 9. So what I want to do is I want to go to 10 and I want to go to 9. And look at this. This is going to be supply, right? So that area resisted perfectly. So I can make an inference and use these levels as support and resistance because there's so much open interest tied to that level, okay? Now I'm not getting into the complexities here of, gamma weighting and looking at gamma and different things like that. But what I am doing is I know that there's interest here. So if you look at this and you say, oh, I thought it could go here, right? But it stopped at 10. And then you didn't look at the options chain, you will oftentimes notice that it stops a lot of the times where the open interest is the highest. So now we know that as a potential candidate for a trade, if I'm using, let's say, basic technical analysis, we're above all the moving averages, we're above that swing high, so I'm looking for bullish trades up to this level, I know that if we get to $10, right, there's going to be a little bit of resistance. So I would be looking for resistance or a breakout from that level. Okay, so that's how I put it all together. Simply put, again, not diving too much into the options chain and the theory behind the gamma or the Greeks and why open interest gets pinned and things like that. Just really focusing in on how I'm using that particular function in cheddar flow, and then I extrapolate it and look further with other analysis. But again, this can be used on whatever type of strategy that you are already or currently implementing. So now let's look at the next one, ARCC, right? There is no opening orders here, and there's no order coming through. That's fine. So we want to look back here and we want to find ARCC. Right here it is. So we see again that this was the one that really didn't, I'm not loving it, because as opposed to OTOY, there's not a lot of bull volume here, but then there's not a lot of bear volume. It's mostly neutral, but again, it showed an uptick of interest, and I can see 95,000 of the call of the volume here was done on the call side. Okay, but again, calls doesn't mean that it's just bullish. It can be bearish as well, because they could be net sellers. But what do we do? Since there's no other order flow, we can go over here to our chart and we can look at ARCC, and we see that this name is trending up, right? So it's just broke out of a recent high. There's your recent high. And again, this video isn't focused on just technical analysis. It's focused on looking and using cheddar flow and combining it all together. And it broke this recent high, tested it, and held. So we can look over here at the trade tab and we can start to do some of the analysis that we did just a minute ago. A lot of the calls were being transacted in the money. And what does that mean for me? If I'm looking for a directional bet, I want to see the volume stacking OTM, because that is showing a much more risky bet than transacting in the money. All right. I look over here at the puts, and what do I see? There isn't much volume on the put side, which is exactly what cheddar flow is showing us. So again, this isn't something that would really, I would look at this and I probably would just throw it off my radar if this is the type of play that I'm looking for in the options market, because it just isn't there. There's not a lot of OTM activity. It did have a positive 1% day, but nothing really to write home about. So this doesn't really give me a good indication of what's going on here. But similar to VXRT, these will still be key levels, 18 and 19. All right. So 18 and 19 will continue to be key levels for this name. And again, you can see you go out to the monthlies and there's really not a whole lot going on here. So this would fall off of my radar, but I would keep VXRT on. So let's go to the last example, which is OTOY. Now, 32,000 versus 26. Most of the volume was done on the call side, and then the bull was 57%. And we can see, we already went over this, there was a lot of puts being sold, and then more than half of the calls on the ask. So what we want to do is we want to flip over to the options order flow tab. We want to search OTLY and see if anything comes up, and there it is. So what are we looking at here? Well, we see a spot price of 27. So they're buying these 30s out of the money, right? I like that already, much better than the other two. They swept the orders, so that is showing a type of aggression. And again, I refer to this and discuss this more in the other video that I've done, but they swept that. It's showing a type of aggression. And then also they're hitting the same strike, but different expiration. This is much further out in expiry. This is next week. So what do I want to do? I want to pull up my chart, and I want to go to OTOY, and I want to break it down. OTOY is a recent issue breaking out of a pivot, right? So there's your low, higher low, higher low. There's a high, there's a high, there's a high. Basic Technical Analysis 101, we're trending up. All right, so what I want to do, I want to flip over to the trade tab, and I want to look to see what's going on here. What's going on? Look at this, the 30s. See what cheddar flow showed us where the volume was coming through? This is going to be an important strike. They are buying the 30s. They're out of the money, and the stock closed at $28.73. So this is showing a much more aggressive intent than VXRT and ARCC. Okay. Now, if we remember from what we saw in the second tab of cheddar flow, the other 30s were being bought in September. Okay. But look at what's going on in July. Look at the volume that's taking place in July at the 30s, right? So we know that 30 is going to be an important level for the stock because across all three of these strikes, there's a ton of volume being done on the call side, right? There's a ton of volume being done on the call side. And look at the put side. There's no volume being done in the thousands. It's only in the hundreds. And there's only 2 prints on the open interest in the thousands as opposed to over here, right? So there's much more call activity than there is put activity. And that is indicative and supportive of what's going on in this move. So I know that if you can use this in 2 ways, as supporting thesis to enter the trade or as looking at resistance. A lot of the people looks at all-time highs and they say, okay, there is no resistance. But we know that by using the unusual volume tab and then looking at the options order flow tab and then taking that a step further and looking at the options chain, we know that 30 is going to be an extraordinarily important level for this name. All right. So those are the 3 main ways that I use the unusual volume tab. Let's recap. Number 1 is arranging the columns in an order that makes sense so that I can sort them in the most beneficial and advantageous manner that is efficient for time and my viewing pleasure. Number 2 is the advanced way of using the unusual volume tab, which is essentially sorting by option volume and looking at it juxtaposed to open interest. I want to see the option volume exceeding open interest, and I want to see it exceeding quite substantially. And combining the other features with cheddar flow. So once we identify something here, going over to the options order flow tab and typing in the name that we identified, and then we can see where the strikes are being hit. We can see the type of order, and then we can go, the last thing, back to our charting platform, pull up the options interface, and we can see the options chain, and we can really get a good idea of what levels are important and more about what the intent is. And lastly, if we really like this name, we can track how open interest and volume changes to see if they're offloading, if they're adding, what's going on with the open interest, if this is a name that I'm really interested in trading. So those are the 3 main ways. And the last thing that I want to mention, which is more my trading style, is I like to trade a core basket of names. And you can use this function in the unusual volume. You can search for names on a day-to-day basis. So for instance, for me, if I like to trade Apple, I could look to see if anything comes up on Apple. If I like to trade Adobe, I can see that, okay, Adobe popped up on unusual volume. That's showing that there is much more interest in this name in the options market than there was on a normal day-to-day basis. And then I can continue that same routine of what I just showed you based on looking at open interest and option volume, and then taking it over to the options order flow, and then going to the options chain on your brokerage platform to start to make really well-informed decisions that can add to any form of technical analysis or system that you're implementing, whether it's dip buying or whether it is breakout buying. All right, last thing I want to remind you of, it's all about proper sorting when using the unusual volume tab. We don't have the filter function on the unusual volume tab like we do on the options order flow. So it's important to sort and then compare. It's not enough to just sort and look. You have to sort, then compare, and then dig a little bit deeper to make the good inferences. And when you combine all of that with your underlying system and own way of viewing and structuring the market, you can really start to have a powerful tool on your hand with this additional functionality of cheddar flow.